It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote for this morning, Helen Sworn. Helen is from the United Kingdom and has been living and working in Cambodia for 16 years with her family. She holds a master's degree in leadership, innovation and change from York University in the UK. Helen has been working in the field of counter-trafficking and abuse since arriving in Cambodia in 1999. During this time, she has worked in the border regions of Cambodia and Thailand with the trafficked children, assisted with the development and implementation of an aftercare home and a reintegration program for trafficked children. She has worked on prevention programs among street children in Phnom Penh, carried out various program research in the field, and served in organisational development and field support roles for other international and local non-government agencies. She founded Shabdai in 2005, and I do hope I've pronounced that correctly, and is now the international director, having the privilege to work with and be inspired by a passionate team of change makers. In 2010, Helen completed a succession plan in handing Shabdai Coalition Cambodia to national Cambodian directors. Since then, she has been responsible for the international strategy and planning for Shabdai, mentoring and coaching the national directors, and also facilitating communication and partnership with agencies such as the United Nations in the Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world, and most recently in developing the Freedom Collaboration, an online coalition and information portal as part of the global learning community, modelling on the lessons learnt from the coalition in Cambodia, and now working in partnership with government, non-government agencies, professionals and academia in more than 20 countries. Her address today is Challenging Present Responses to Victims, a Case for Long-Term Focus and Research. Please join me in welcoming Helen Sworn.
Good morning. And if you're anything like me in the morning, maybe you've only had one coffee in and you're still a little sleepy, but there's nothing like 0 degrees to wake you up on the walk over, hey? It is such a privilege to be here. This is my first victimology conference, and so I feel like I'm being exposed to a whole new wealth of learning. So I feel kind of very humbled to be here this morning and to speak in front of what I would consider many experts from around the globe, and so I just hope that what I have to contribute this morning will be a small part of our joint learning process together. And my first time to Perth, and I haven't experienced 0 degrees for a very long time, having come out of the hot season in Cambodia where we were hitting about 45, 46 degrees. So suddenly I have so much energy in this climate. So as has been said, my heartland is Cambodia. My homeland is the UK. And so if I was in Cambodia, this is how I would greet you this morning. Jumriap Sur Dien Okania. And so that is how I'm used to introducing my time with you this morning. What I'd like us to do is, I'm going to set a scene here. My son said to me, just use photographs, Mum, because you already say 1,000 words, so the photographs can speak for you. They know that I speak far too much. So I really want to set a little bit of the scene for Cambodia. I apologize for those of you who may already know a lot of this information, but I think that this is a critical foundation for moving on to what we're going to discuss about long-term research and the need for long-term research. So if we look at Cambodia, right now we have a population of around 15 million. Cambodia in 1979 emerged from a civil war, from the Khmer Rouge era, where more than 3 million people died. Directly after that Khmer Rouge era, the Vietnamese came in, and if you ask Cambodians, invaded. If you ask Westerners, liberated. History is very subjective, hey? And so now we have a population where around 30% of the population are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. If we layer on top of that the fact that there are very few resources in Cambodia, the government still does not have a functioning infrastructure, even though hundreds of millions of dollars have been put into Cambodia, around 60 million still every year. What we're seeing is that 3 years ago, the first social work degree program graduated. 3 years ago, the population where 30% have got post-traumatic stress. So it'll give you a little bit of an indicator of the environment that we're working in before we start looking at the issue of human trafficking. Cambodia, because of this lack of infrastructure and lack of services, really the NGOs make up a lot of the infrastructure for health, for education, for social services, and still there is no common terminology on trauma definitions even. So even before we look at the services that we need, there are still no common definitions. An example is, we have common definitions around depression. And we may have sort of like some slight differences, but we have defined working practices around what depression is. Well, in Cambodia, there aren't any direct translations of that. And the Cambodian people would say, "Dak jang jit nyom," which is basically water has fallen from my heart. That is how they describe depression. And so when we try and put that back into English, it seems so abstract, water has fallen from my heart. But this has really slowed down a lot of the response mechanisms and infrastructure around dealing with a lot of the trauma in Cambodia. If we look at Cambodian culture, which of course I love because it is my heartland, but I can also see a lot of the challenges there. It's very much a collective culture. And so you are identified within your family. You are identified as the daughter or the sister or the mother. So you are identified within a collective culture, which again, when we get onto the issues around working with survivors of sexual exploitation and trafficking, actually becomes a massive risk factor. It's also a patronage culture. So, for example, if you speak to any of the survivors who are in shelter programs, and as the shelter program, if you then start to evaluate your own program and you say, how are you finding it in our shelter? Well, of course, because you're their patron, they are going to say that everything is amazing and beautiful and wonderful. And so it's very difficult to get to the true issues and to really kind of extract a balanced perspective. And the last cultural aspect that I just want to say right now is the shame culture. And many of us from the West understand the guilt culture, but the shame culture, again, extends not just to the individual, but how that impacts your family. And I remember we were probably in Cambodia, I think, for 2 years, and a young man who was working for us, he needed a job, so he kind of just ended up doing some gardening, although we didn't really have a garden. But anyway, he ended up stealing a lot of money from us, and it was quite a significant amount. And so I went to his sister and said, we need to address this. And about 2 or 3 days later, I was pretty taken aback. His father turned up on the doorstep, and his father would probably have been about 75 years old, a Cambodian man who would probably be no taller than this, emancipated, obviously had survived the Khmer Rouge years, but was highly traumatized and a very sick man. And he crawled into my house on his hands and knees with his hands above his head like this, which is kind of, you're saying that you are the lowest and you're addressing somebody who is the highest, like you would address a king. And he said, "I will sell my land so that I can pay you back the money that my son stole from you." And at that moment, I realized just how deep the shame onto the family goes. And of course, I said, well, actually, he didn't really steal very much money. And, the last thing I wanted to do was for this old man to sell his land. But that's really kind of the depth that it goes. I'm just going to put up some kind of random pictures here. The anti-trafficking movement. So the anti-trafficking movement, or anti-slavery movement, as it's called and interchanged, is still a young movement. It's awesome to be here at the Victimology Symposium, and I feel like this movement has many more decades of experience. I feel like, like a teenager still, that we are very immature as a movement. If we look at how the whole movement has emerged into the global consciousness, has mostly been through the media. We've had celebrity heroes who have taken it on as their, issue of the day. Anne was talking yesterday about glossy stories, and that is really how it's been portrayed, through glossy stories of 5-year-olds going in, kicking down brothel doors, dragging out 5-year-olds and rescuing them, which creates this beautiful sort of hero, savior mentality of coming in and saving the poor Cambodians. And this high exposure to media created this influx of agencies, of individuals who, although very well-meaning, really had little understanding of what was happening on the ground, had really not studied the issue of human trafficking. Most people, as well as their consciousness being raised from media, were educated through media, and so people would come to the ground to set up a shelter, and they had read, a half a dozen news articles, and which is a little disturbing, because we know that, in the professional social service spectrum, to just come in and say, well, I just kind of feel bad for those victims, and I'm just gonna give them some love. It's like we would be, wow, no, you can't do that. But this is what everybody was doing when they were coming to Cambodia. They're like, all we need to do is love on them. I'm like, wow, no. Actually, we need something that is much, much deeper and more professional. But because this was the framework of everybody coming to the ground, excuse me, we started to see an environment of chaos, actually, of so many people coming to the ground, a little bit like, when there's been a disaster zone somewhere around the world. And of course, all the humanitarian organizations hit the ground. And the critical piece at that time, especially in the early days, is coordination. If you don't have coordination in those early days, you're going to have some families and individuals that get a couple of shelters and 5 meals a day, and some who will starve to death. And so the humanitarian organizations know that. So they know that the coordination in those early hours and those early days and weeks and months is critical, so that service provision is professional and well coordinated. So basically what's happened is Cambodia has become like a petri dish, really, for experimenting on programs and projects, and many, we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, and maybe a little bit more of the latter, and we've really seen a lot of money and a lot of people pour into Cambodia, but very little of time to stop and what we're doing here to challenge our orthodoxies. A couple of years ago, Chabdai, we did a research called The Journey of Change, and we looked at a decade of the anti-trafficking movement in Cambodia, and we looked at what were the influencing factors to the movement, and what were some of the shifts and changes, what had the government done, what had the NGOs done, and who was influenced by research. And it was a little disturbing that most people who were working on the ground had been influenced way more by media than any form of research. And so we had a situation where we just did not have enough research on the ground, professional research, to understand what our environment was. Research was mostly used really as an entry point to get donor funding and to justify programs. A researcher called Dirks in 2005 did a critical review of research in Cambodia during 1995 to 2005, and the research methodologies were so varied, and almost none of the research was collaborative. It was very contradictory, and very little in the way of good professional grounding. So we were all operating on the ground with very little professional expertise. So I'm just showing you some of the street scenes of Cambodia. So Chabdai. We've been operating for 10 years now, started as a year pilot. I explained the foundation, and so our ethos as an organization was to establish a coalition and to see that what we needed to do to address a networked problem, which human trafficking is globally, we need a network solution. So we established a coalition. As I said, NGOs have really made up a lot of the government infrastructure instead. So we established a national referral mechanism and really became a coordinating body for many of the organizations on the ground, looking at raising standards of care, looking at training Cambodian staff. Organizations would come to the ground and they would say, okay, I'm going to set up a shelter for 5-year-olds. I know my greatest challenge is going to be raising funds. So no. Your greatest challenge is not going to be raising funds. It's going to be finding staff. Because if you can't find staff, how are you going to help those that you're working with on the journey of healing? And so for most organizations, if they had one professional staff member in their entire organization or shelter, they were doing well. Pretty much everybody else who was working in that environment were learning in the workplace. So they're called social workers and counselors, but they've had no professional training at all. So we realized this was a huge gap. And I'm going to come on to burnout a little bit later, but we saw that because there was very little in the way of professional training, there was no supervision, there was no understanding of vicarious trauma. And we had, of course, these staff are coming from a population of 30% of suffering from post-traumatic stress, and then they're working in a shelter. So some had massive mental breakdowns, and Cambodia does not have services for that. They would basically be admitted to hospital and just heavily sedated. That was the response to vicarious trauma and breakdown. One of the things that we did in the early days, and I know this is still kind of setting the scene, is we looked at, what are the issues that we're all addressing? I actually come from a business background, which I know I tend to find myself apologizing for that when, I'm with service providers. So I came from a business background and then into research when I hit the ground in Cambodia. But as I saw this, I thought, what we need is like a business strategy. So we need to know what are our issues, our competitor analysis, who's doing what and where are the gaps and the overlaps. And so we realized in those early days that there were no prevention programs, nothing. Everybody was starting shelters. It's like, well, that's great, but you know what? It's like that cliff edge. They all just keep coming over the top and you've got all the ambulances down the bottom, but at some point we need to build a fence to stop them dropping in the first place. And so nobody wanted to start prevention. It wasn't a sexy program to raise funds for. So having set up a coalition, prevention was actually really sexy. So we started prevention programs, began to develop a grassroots advocacy network among community gatekeepers, village leaders, commune leaders, religious leaders, so Christian pastors, Buddhist monks, Muslim imams, school teachers, who are now this amazing, what we call community hero network, where about 40% of all of our cases come from. And in a country where there's been civil war and mistrust, everybody said there is no way you're going to establish a network on the ground where people are going to care for each other. So, well, you don't know until you start. So they've been really amazing. So we have our own case team. We take on about 170 cases a year, not just trafficking, but forced marriage, domestic violence, and many other human rights abuses. So, the Butterfly Project. As Anne said yesterday, and really what an act to follow, we need survivors to tell us what they need to help them heal. And after a few years of working on the ground, we started to see the need to challenge these orthodoxies and challenge our own assumptions as well. But it's often quite a threatening process, especially when donors are looking at you and other people. So we started asking ourselves a series of questions. Is what we do working? We may have 300 survivors in shelter programs, but are they working? How do we define success or case closed? How do we decide when a case should be closed? How do we know? When should we find out? Should we ask questions at the beginning or at the end? Who should we ask? Should we ask the clients themselves? Should we ask the staff? Then who should ask the questions? In a patronage culture, if I'm running a shelter, I'm not going to be able to ask the questions. A neutral entity is critical. Then we say, well, who is this research for? If the donor hasn't asked for it, most people don't want to do any research. Or, maybe they want to keep it internal if the findings are not glossy and positive. A lot of it could be quite threatening. Then how long do we ask for? 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year? Very little was asked after a year. And the other aspect that we were starting to ask questions around as we saw a lot of short-term researchers come in, access clients, because again, there were very few professional frameworks, access clients, ask them questions, re-traumatize them. So we said, well, how can we do this in an ethical and empathetic and empowering manner? So we don't want to re-traumatize the clients that have come through these programs. So we started asking these questions, and in 2006, we did a research with ethnic Vietnamese communities, and the reason we did this research is that we found that even though the ethnic Vietnamese communities in Cambodia make up around 5% of the population, they were making up around 65 to 70% of all the girls that were entering into shelters from commercial sexual exploitation. So we realized that we had quite a challenge within the ethnic Vietnamese communities. And from our research, we found that 80 to 90% of all the families in the ethnic Vietnamese communities were selling their daughters. 80 to 90%. So, of course, we needed to start an ethnic prevention program. But at the same time, International Organization for Migration were doing complementary research. So we were looking at the source villages, and they were looking at the destination brothels, and then what had happened to these Vietnamese women afterwards. This was the catalyst for Butterfly. As I read their research after we had done our own, there was a case study in there. And it was a case study of an ethnic Vietnamese woman who had been commercially sexually exploited. She was rescued in one of the brothel raids and sent to a shelter. And during her time at the shelter, she did really well. She went through a lot of the counseling and managed to do some vocational skills training. And after about a year and a half or 2 years, she actually left the shelter and moved into the community. And when she got into the community, she managed to find a job. And so the shelter at that point said, okay, a success. I think I would have probably said the same. Later on, she got married, and which again is really amazing because for many of these women, it's very difficult for them to find husbands after they've been in this kind of shameful situation for their communities. And so she got married, her and her husband moved into another community. And after a while, people in that community began to find out what had happened to her. So the women began to shun her. They didn't want to talk to her anymore. And the men in the community began to proposition her. And she found this devastating, of course. So her and her husband moved to another village, to another area. After a while, the same thing happened again. By the third move, and when this was happening again, she was so desperate that after 5 years of leaving the shelter as a success case, she committed suicide. And, you know, I believe knowledge equals responsibility. At that point, we realized for the very first time, we actually don't know what we don't know because we'd never asked the questions. We'd looked at that case for a year or 2 years and said, yay, we've got a success. That 5 years down the track, after she had overcome everything she had gone through, she saw no future for her life. And so that suicide story was the catalyst for us in 2007 gathering the shelter programs together. So I can remember now sitting together with maybe about 8 or 9 shelter organizations and saying, we need to do a longitudinal research. I had never done a longitudinal research, okay, ever. I said, we need a 10-year research. We need to track the lives of those that we're working with for 10 years. And I said, you know, it's interesting how we all know that trauma lasts a lifetime and it's a journey of healing. But, you know, many of the programs lasted a year. So we said, we need to be able to do this longitudinal research. Most of the shelters were like, no. I don't want you to have access to what our clients are saying about us and what they may be saying about our programs and what isn't working. So they said, why don't you just do 2 years? But nope. 10 years. Has to be 10 years. And so we were in this kind of negotiating situation. And so then I started approaching donors and saying, okay, can somebody fund this? Donors were like, a longitudinal research? No. This is like an emergency situation. So do a research now and we'll fund it, like, but have it finished in 6 months. Like, no, we need 10 years. So we realized that there was nobody listening to the voices of survivors. Nobody. In a shame culture, those survivors did not want to set up survivor movements. They did not want to speak out. Their families certainly didn't want them to speak out because they would all be shamed. So all the programs that we were working on, everything that we were doing were basically from our own assumptions. We had almost no input from those that we were working with. So then we started looking at some other academic institutions and saying, hey, well, would you like to come in and do longitudinal research? Nobody wanted to come in and do longitudinal research. They said, well, come in, and if you give us access to all your clients, we'll interview them and do a one-off research, but not longitudinal. So 3 years later, we started the butterfly research. It took a while. Eventually, we managed to persuade 15 aftercare partners to come on board. And we had a massively ambitious vision, but our vision was to see better informed programs, not just aftercare, but we wanted survivor voices to inform prevention, to inform intervention, to inform policy and advocacy. And so, so we started with a very small team of 4 people. We had access to 128 survivors, 80% female, 20% male. 43% of those were adult, 67 children. 65% were ethnically Cambodian. Then we had about 10% Vietnamese, 8% Vietnamese Khmer, Chinese Khmer, and Thai Khmer. So we had ethnic diversity within the group. And then we had just a very small control group of 4 women who had declined assistance, which was really helpful for us to have that control group. The methodology for us in the early days to inform the questionnaires and the surveys was we went into the shelters and developed a lot of focus group discussions, and they themselves expressed what types of questions and what types of themes we should be exploring. And so the entire framework of the methodology was very participatory by the survivors from the very early days. So the focus was for us to interact with the cohort at least 2 to 3 times a year with these questionnaires, and to develop longitudinal data analysis from the quantitative data we were accessing from these participants. As I said, we had not done this before, and it was a highly challenging process to start, but you know, we just decided we are learners and we need to move this forward. These are just some of the images of the research, and I'll give you a link to how to access them afterwards. Of course, I don't have any photos of our clients. These are all our amazing team members. So the research, as Eric Stover said yesterday, that we're in it for the long game. And when we first started this research, you know, we realized that we knew very little. and there must be all sorts of longitudinal research happening all over the world that we could learn from. And so we started to reach out as far and wide as we could to academic institutions, and we spoke with the US State Department, TIP office, and other entities, and discovered at that point that we were the only longitudinal research team working with survivors of sex trafficking, which felt quite pressurized, really. Not something that we had expected. We call this research our perfect storm, that, you know, we're working with a cohort of 128 survivors who are highly transient, highly traumatized. We are working with 15 shelter partner agencies who are highly demanding and not always easy to work with. And then we're working within a longitudinal methodology. So we call it the perfect storm. And I think that as we reflect back, we looked at some of our areas of that our participants were saying were their greatest challenges. It's so hard to capture. We're in year 6 now. So hard to capture so much data, but you can access all of the research. One of the critical areas was health, physical and emotional health. Many of the cohort had significant health issues from their time that they were traumatized. Many of them had had multiple abortions and STDs and other massive health problems. Emotional health, even though many of these had come through shelter programs. As I said at the very beginning, we don't even have a common set of definitions around trauma. So many of the shelters are using Western therapeutic models, which, I mean, at least they are now using Western therapeutic models, but we need Cambodian therapeutic models that are still emerging. Another critical issue for them was the sense of family responsibility. And a lot of this is around the cultural aspect of filial piety, where, you know, they have an honor, a debt honor to pay back to their parents, to pay back to their family. And so the sense of responsibility is huge, and one of the greatest risk factors when they go back to the community. Violence. So, you know, we say that when these participants, these survivors were in the before they were in the shelter, of course, they were experiencing huge levels of violence in establishments of commercial sexual exploitation. And there was that, because the movement had been informed by media, there was this simplistic understanding that once you take them out of that environment, then they're going to remain safe, because they're no longer going to be victimized. And again, from sitting in this conference, you know, we realized that those who have suffered from any type of exploitation are very much more vulnerable to ongoing other aspects of exploitation. So violence in relationships, many of them who developed partner relationships or got married were in very violent situations. Stigma, the trust issues. Many of the families and even the husbands did not know what had happened to the women. And many of them had said that our research team were the only people who knew all of their life story. And so it kind of brings me on to our research team, who are amazing. We just lost one research team member who moved to France, unfortunately, and so right now we've got 4 on our team. And at the beginning of the research, 100% of the participants were in shelters. So we could go in and interview them quite easily. Right now, in year 6, just over 50% of them are already reintegrated back to community. So it means that our staff sometimes have to travel 8 or 9 hours to meet just one participant. And many of them had come from very rural areas in the beginning. And so after they had been through a shelter program in the city, they would go back out to the rural areas. And so you have these extremes. That's in the flooded season. And in tiny little boats on the Mekong River, it's a little hairy, let me tell you, during wet season. And so the staff are really one of the only consistent relationships that those participants have. They have ended up being their confidants. They have ended up basically being on 24/7 call. So for our own research team, they have become counseling support. In fact, we ended up having to send them on through counseling training because they weren't just researchers. Secondary trauma. You know, they will get calls in the middle of the night saying, my husband or my partner has just beaten me, or my family has just made me go back to work in the karaoke bars or the entertainment centers, and I'm going to commit suicide. And they're 9 hours away by car. So we actually had to start putting our own research team through supervision and debriefing for the secondary trauma that they were experiencing in working with this cohort. You know, we don't have even, we have very few professional researchers in Cambodia. And so this research team you can see are all young. They've all got their undergrad degrees, and now we're sponsoring them through postgrad degrees, but they're still learning as researchers, and now they're also counselors. So when they go out to the field to interview the clients, the participants, basically they go out as friends. There's no way they're going to go out with a clipboard and say, okay, I've come to interview this girl. They go out as friends. Now they get invited to weddings. They get invited to births of the children of the women, and they have developed this very, very close rapport and relationship. And really that has helped counteract what was one of our greatest risk factors, and that was the risk of attrition. With the longitudinal research, we had no idea what our attrition levels would be, and we knew that even though that in itself is a finding, we were going to be able to, it was going to be challenging for us to really move on with any type of data if we had a tiny, tiny cohort set. So what happened at the end of our 4th year, threw the research on its head again. And we ended up having to change all of our methodology. We found between years 3 and year 4 that our data, and this is the quantitative data, was highly contradictory. So for the first 3 years, our cohort were telling us a particular story and giving us feedback. By year 4, they started giving us different information. So as we start to do our data cleaning and start doing our comparatives, we're trying to work out why our quantitative data, such as ages, the demographics of ages and ethnicities and their stories, had changed considerably. So we went back to the participants and said, wow, 4 years in, you're telling us completely different information. And they're saying, now I can trust you. You've been the constant support in my life for the last 4 years. Now I'm going to tell you the truth. So we started to look at what we had done the previous 3 years and go, do we ditch this? What do we do? Our donors were, what's happened to this research? I said, well, they're telling us the truth now. Like, what? What have you been doing for the last 3 years? Well, we thought they were telling us the truth, but now they say they are telling us the truth. And I was sat actually in the US State Department in the tip office sharing this, and around the table, one of the staff there said, so all the research that we have, how do we know it's true? I said, well, you don't. So yes, you have been putting in millions of dollars. They don't fund our research. You have been putting in millions of dollars, and how do we know what is true? So we realize that truth is so connected to trust. And I don't know if it's got this far, but last year and this year, there's been a lot of media hype from somebody called Somali Mam, who's a Cambodian survivor who has been running a program. And so a lot of it was highly controversial. A lot of donors started saying, she's been lying. She hasn't been telling the truth about her story. And we're like, right. She's a survivor. She needs to be able to trust before she tells truth. And so massive learning experience for us. So what we started to realize is that we needed to increase our qualitative aspect of the research. And our team started transcribing 96 life stories. For those of us who've done research, I'm like, I struggled when I was doing like 20 interviews. They are transcribing 96 life stories, not only transcribing them in Khmer, of course, but then translating them in English, and all of the challenges that translation and terminology creates. We were saying, the participants use the word Tomada, life is Tomada, which is really a direct translation into English would be normal. So we're like, their lives aren't normal. How can they say their lives are normal? This is far from normal. And then, if you look at the nuance of the word Tomada, actually it means really nothing's changed. So even just the nuances of the translation has presented us with a lot of challenges. So we increased the use of interviews. We started doing content analysis on a lot of the interviews and the words that were coming out. And we started producing thematic papers. And so last year we produced our first thematic paper on resilience. And so I was sharing this actually with some partners from Thailand a couple of weeks ago, and afterwards they were like, "Wow, that's depressing." I'm like, yeah, it is. There's not much resilience there. No, there isn't. And so right now we're in the middle of one on stigma, which is probably going to be even more depressing. But it's really about us, again, challenging all of our assumptions and challenging what we thought was truth, and how that information in the short term can really skew our level of understanding and how we develop programs. So we started looking at issues qualitatively around their well-being, still looking at health and relationships, family. We looked at their financial and economic situation, family support, debt. We looked at their education levels and their need for education, formal and non-formal. We started to explore much more deeply what was their vision and hopes and plans and aspirations for the future. We had a lot of interaction around an assessment of the services that they had received. and we actually feed those directly back to the shelters. Those don't go in the research. What was their experiences within the legal system, court system, working with authorities such as law enforcement? And then we'd have a lot of open field questions. What would they want to say as survivors to others? What advice would they have? How could they feed into the greater movement? And then really their experience of being a part of the research and whether they had found that traumatizing or whether they had actually found that healing as a process. And we give all of our participants access into social services as well. So we've come to this point now that we have an incredible amount of data. We've got all of this quantitative data and qualitative data, and so at this point now, we feel that we actually have a responsibility, knowing that this is the only research of its kind globally, in how can we ethically and responsibly give others access to this data, access to these data sets, so that other disciplines can help the movement learn more and outside the confines of just the anti-trafficking movement, which is why I'm so happy to be at this conference. So, implications, really. This is our research advisor in the middle who lives in the UK right now. So, what a great team. Michael O'Connor said this week, that we're obligated to listen and obligated to act. And I love that because I really feel like, the more knowledge we gain, the greater our level of responsibility. So we're seeing that for longitudinal research is critical for advocacy. It's critical to government informing policy. Government find it far more difficult to deny situations when there is a longitudinal study that is happening, especially when it's collaborative. Advocacy with community, in decreasing prejudice and stigma, in increasing access to justice and hope. At service level, looking at program design, again, we need this longitudinal focus point to look at prevention programs, aftercare, looking at how have the nature of exploitation and cases changed. Looking at partnerships and collaboration, which is kind of the heart of what we're doing. NGOs need to be working far closer with academia and vice versa. There needs to be a more transparent learning culture within the NGO and service provision sector. We need academic partnerships. We need to increase the research integrity and analysis. We need to feed this longitudinal research back to donors. Donors need to know that, if I look at the last 2 decades of the movement and how many hundreds of millions of dollars have been pushed in, why is it that we have one longitudinal research? It's horrifying, really, that there's all of these resources and they're not being channeled into long-term learning. And for us, it's about the survivors, especially in a collective culture. This is a dignifying and confidential and empowering way that these survivors can express their voice, where they don't bring stigma on themselves or on their family. Of course, in the future, we want to see a greater movement for them. But right now, we need to find avenues, long-term avenues that they can feed their voice into. So as they embark on their lifelong journey of healing, we, the community that are here to support them, need to embark on a lifelong journey of hearing, of learning, of responding to their voices to inform not just the anti-trafficking movement, the anti-slavery movement, but beyond that. Thank you.